that respects certain values. It is instilled in us that the sanctity of human life is a belief that we must uphold. Our parents demand it, our religious institutions preach it, and our teachers expound upon it. The words, "Thou shalt not kill," is etched in our brains. Time passes, and with it the certainty that life is always sacred. At first, bits and pieces come to us that are contrary to our beliefs. We find that killings is at times legitimatized. Excuse me. In time of war and in defense of one's own life are two instances where the life of another can be taken without fear of punishment. The issue is further clouded when we learn that some states execute convicted criminals for capital offenses, while other states do not. As adults, we engage in a debate that has been fueled by rage and alcohol throughout the century. Should there be a death penalty? As one might expect, the opinions are varied. Many people believe that we as a society have no right to take the life of an individual, even one convicted of a heinous crime such as murder. Other people believe if a person chooses to terminate an innocent life, then that person has also lost his right to live. But isn't the intentional taking of another's life murder no matter how it's done or who is doing it? Should society be allowed to make exceptions, and should the death penalty be one of those exceptions? I, for one, believe that the death penalty is an ineffective tool in the fight against crime, because it is imperfect and inhumane. The issue of deterrence. The death penalty does not deter crime, since it is not consistently and promptly employed. Ironically enough, most first-degree murderers are not sentenced to death, and even less are executed. Of the offenders convicted of criminal homicide, only 1 in 50 is eventually sentenced to death. It is stated that crime is either premeditated or not premeditated. Those committing outlandish crimes such as kidnapping, gangland killings, drive-by shootings, and air piracy believe that they will not get caught and are therefore not deterred by the threat of the death penalty. When the crime is not premeditated, one cannot even judge how any form of punishment could deter it. In addition, most crimes are committed when the offender is under the influence of drugs or alcohol, and they're not thinking straight. Depending on the crime, the threat of any kind of punishment is pointless. Most terrorists are willing to die as martyrs, and most people trafficking drugs are more likely to get killed by their competition. Thus said, if the idea of taking someone's life does not deter people from committing a crime, then life imprisonment will suffice. It is proven that death penalty states do not have lower rates of criminal homicide than non-death penalty states. In fact, states that abolished the death penalty had an average rate of 7.4 homicides per 100,000 population in the 1980s, while death penalty states had a rate of 7.5. The issue of financial costs. The death penalty is more expensive than life in prison. One must take into account the cost of prosecutors, public defenders, judges, court reporters, and the high cost of briefs. All these litigation costs come out of the taxpayers' dollars. Since murder trials take longer when the death penalty is at hand, the cost of capital punishment exceeds the cost of life in prison. A study conducted in 1982 concluded that if the death penalty were to be introduced in New York, the cost of the trial would be 2 times more than life in prison. Capital trial costs in Maryland cost 42% more when resulting in a death sentence as opposed to a non-death sentence. Kansas decided against reinstating the death penalty due to the fact that the first-year cost would be around $11 million. The average execution in the United States costs anywhere from $2.5 million to $5 million, while the average cost of life imprisonment is about $20,000 per inmate. If the inmate lives about 50 years, their sentence will cost around $1 million. Therefore, the death penalty is 2.5 to 5 times as much as life in prison. Timothy McVeigh, the Oklahoma City bomber, provides an excellent example at how costly the death penalty is. The government spent $82.5 million to investigate and prosecute McVeigh, and over $15 million for defense. The only way to cut the cost of the death penalty is to cut the cost of justice. The issue of women, mentally ill, and juvenile offenders. The 8th Amendment prohibits cruel and unusual punishment. Safeguard 3 states that persons below 18 years of age at the time of the commission of the crime shall not be sentenced to death, nor shall the death sentence be carried out on pregnant women or on new mothers or on persons who have become insane. Safeguard 3 was updated in 1989 by eliminating the death penalty for persons suffering from mental retardation or extremely limited mental competence, whether at the stage of sentence or execution. Yet over the last 10 years, dozens of prisoners suffering from diseases such as bipolar disorder, schizophrenia, and other incapacitating mental illnesses have been executed in the United States. Since the courts have been using a very constrictive definition of incompetence, state and federal courts were urged to take more consideration when evaluating the mental state of individuals facing execution. The Supreme Court case of Roper v. Simmons concluded that the execution of juvenile offenders was a violation of the Eighth Amendment and was cruel and unusual punishment since 16 and 17-year-olds do not have the maturity level of a grown adult. In addition, the last region of the brain to develop is the prefrontal cortex, which is responsible for aiding an individual in determining right from wrong, differentiating between conflicting concepts, and maintaining social control. Since it is believed that most teenagers lack a sense of responsibility, most states already prohibit teens from voting and serving on jury duty. The issue of racial and geographical inequalities. Race and geography greatly influence decisions made related to capital punishment. Studies show that race, skin color, and facial features matter when sentencing someone to death. There is also a greater amount of bias coming from police towards African Americans. For example, an offender is 4 times as likely to be sentenced to death in Philadelphia if the person is black. 4,116 people were executed in the United States between 1930 and 1990. 2,129, or 53% of those executed, were black. Since the revival of the death penalty in the mid-1970s, about half of those offenders on death row at any given time have been black. Also, offenders are 4.3 times as likely to be sentenced to death in cases where the victim is white. In addition, there is an underlying current of racism found in many who support the death penalty. Since there is not a set of uniform standards when it comes to the death penalty, geographical disparities will arise. The majority of prosecutors are elected officials who are greatly influenced by the surrounding community when it comes to opposing or supporting capital punishment. For example, the local prosecutor in San Francisco is opposed to the death penalty and rarely seeks it, while in Tulare County, California, the prosecutor is an advocate of the death penalty. Although the entire United States is governed by the same Constitution, southern states account for over 80% of all executions in the United States, while the Northeast accounts for only 1%. 1/3 of the executions in the United States occur in the state of Texas. Therefore, individuals who commit the same crime can receive 2 very different verdicts. The issue of wrongful conviction. Wrongful conviction is a widespread phenomenon. There's no turning back once an innocent person is killed. With new innovations in DNA testing, many wrongful convictions have been overturned. Evidence depicts that innocent people are convicted of crimes ranging all the way up to capital punishments, and some are even executed. An innocent person has been convicted of murder more than 4 cases per year since 1900. 117 wrongfully convicted individuals have been released from death row as of September 2004. As of 2007, there have been 200 pardons of people who have been wrongfully convicted. Furthermore, 1 in every 70 death sentences involves a person who is later found innocent. Overzealous prosecution, mistaken or perjured testimony, faulty police work, coerced confession, the defendant's previous criminal record, inept defense counsel, seemingly conclusive circumstantial evidence, community pressure for conviction. They're all factors that explain why the criminal justice system is not always 100% accurate. The issue of inhumaneness. The death penalty is barbaric and inhumane. Currently, death by electrocution, gas, firing squad, hanging, and lethal injection are legal in 1 or more states. Hanging can go easily wrong if the rope is too long or too short. The person can be decapitated or they can die a slow death due to strangulation. In the past, electrocution was a very popular form of execution. The offender is strapped to a chair and electrodes are placed on their heads and legs. The voltage is raised high enough that smoke often rises from the person's head. Part of the reason that electrocution is considered so inhumane is that the burning body will start to smell, and there's no consensus as to how long the victim retains consciousness. When it comes to the latest mode of execution, lethal injection, there's no way to determine if in fact it is painless. What scares me more than the idea of execution is the thought that people write to the executioner asking to be notified if the job ever becomes vacant and if they could watch the executions. Supreme Court Justice Arthur J. Goldberg once wrote that the deliberate institutionalized taking of a human life by the state is the greatest conceivable degradation to the dignity of the human personality. The issue of closure. The word closure is invoked so frequently in discussion of victims and the death penalty that victims' family members jokingly refer to it as the C word. Many death penalty supporters advocate killing offenders as a form of closure for victims' families. However, if closure is in fact needed to heal the victims' families, then why is the death penalty applied to only about 1% of convicted murderers in the country? On the contrary, killing such offenders does not solve anything, since closure can only come from punishment such as life without parole, forgiveness, or meeting the offender. Victims' families watch executions for many different reasons. Some want to find closure, some want revenge, and some want justice. The truth is that many of the families do not find closure watching the offender die.
Thou shalt not kill. This phrase resonates with each one of us. From the time we are small, we are brought up to know that crime is the wrong road to take. Of any crime one could commit, murder is considered to be the most heinous. We are taught, whether we are religious or not, that murder is abhorrent and unacceptable in society, that murder is vile, and that those who commit murder have no right to do so. If they did, then there would be no courts. There would be no justice system, no reason for trying them. There would be no prisons or death houses within those prison walls. Society has been dealing with murderers since biblical times, usually through an eye for eye policy. Murderers have been put to death for centuries. In the middle of the 20th century, however, people began to question the legality and morality of capital punishment. In 1967, they decided to halt capital punishment until 1976. This law came into effect in 1972, commuting many prisoner sentences to life instead of death. Capital punishment is defined as the execution of condemned prisoners by the state or federal governments within a given country. While many view the death penalty as an example of cruel and/or unusual punishment, and say that there is no point in killing somebody due to the risk of killing the wrong person, there are benefits to the death penalty. There are many reasons why the death penalty is good for society and why it should be enforced. The first is related to morality, which is a question that comes up often. It's immoral to commit heinous crimes against humanity, such as violent murder. Therefore, removing immoral people from our society, such as murderers, effectively reduces the amount of immoral activity in a country. Many question what right we have to take a man's life or woman's life, even if he or she is guilty of committing the same crimes, horrific crimes against humanity. As a country, we have a moral obligation to protect our citizens from harm. Therefore, we have the same right to take a killer's life as they took the victim's life. Murder is not the same as execution. Murder is defined in any dictionary as, quote, the unlawful killing of a person with malice and forethought. Execution is punishment, a prevention method. it is the law, and therefore the death penalty is not murder. Nineteenth century English philosopher and reformer John Stuart Mill once stated, Does finding a criminal show want of respect for poverty, or imprisoning him for personal freedom? Just as unreasonable it is to think that to take a life of a man who has taken that of another is to show want of regard for human life. We show on the country our regard for it by the adoption of a rule that he who violates that right to human life must also be violated. That he who forfeits that life of another must also forfeit his own life. And that while no other crime be committed that he can commit depraves, we must deprive him of his right to live. And so we shall. The death penalty shows that humans are capable of choosing their fates. Murderers and other violent criminals who pose a threat to peaceful living in a society are placed through a rigorous test of competency. If they are able to determine and differentiate right from wrong, and to know for certain that they have committed a crime, then they are competent enough to stand trial. A killer who is competent enough to stand trial is also able to answer for his crimes. The death penalty acts as a deterrent against a killer. Death penalty acts as a deterrent against a killer committing his crimes a second time. Humans are naturally frightened of death, and so by putting the fear of death into criminals, it is believed that criminals will not commit crimes. Fear of death will keep a man from committing murder because he does not want to face the same consequence. While states in America who have capital punishment instated have higher crime rates, the reason for the use of capital punishment is caused by these high crime rates. People argue that a killer acts in the heat of the moment and therefore does not consider the consequences of his or her crimes. Why then do some killers take life into their own hands and commit suicide rather than face a jury and be held accountable for their actions? When a police officer making an arrest orders a criminal onto the ground or to place his or her hands behind their heads, why does the criminal comply? The criminal is frightened of the gun, frightened of the power of death the officer holds over him. It has been argued that fear of death will not stop criminals from committing crimes, will not prevent murder. In fact, the opposite is true. It increases the amount of homicides in a given place. During the temporary suspension on capital punishment in America from 1972 to 1976, researchers gathered murder statistics across the country. In 1960, there were 56 executions in the USA and 9,140 murders. By 1964, when there were only 15 executions, the number of murders had risen to 9,250. In 1969, there were no executions and 14,590 murders. And in 1975, after 6 more years without executions, 20,510 murders occurred, rising to 23,040 murders in 1980, after the only 2 executions since 1976. In summary, between 1965 and 1980, the number of annual murders in the United States skyrocketed from 9,960 to 23,040, a 131% increase. The murder rate, homicides per 100,000 persons, doubled from 5.1 to 10.2%. So the number of murders grew as the number of executions decreased. Researchers of the Texas A&M said, while some death penalty abolitionists try to face down the results of their disastrous exemplary and still argue to the contrary, the data concludes that the death penalty does act as a deterrent, and the effect is obvious. Criminals fear for their lives and so will not commit crime. In 6 months, more Americans are murdered than have killed by executions in this entire century. Until we begin to fight crime in earnest, by using the death penalty, every person who dies at a criminal's hands is a victim of our inaction. The death penalty is also acts as a means for providing solace for a victim's family. It's not meant to bring revenge or retribution. The death penalty is meant to be an example of what occurs if people commit crimes against their fellow man. The states of Texas executed more murderers than any other state. The Texas murder rate in 1991 was 15.3 per 100,000 people. In 1999, it had fallen to 6.1. That's a 60% decrease. Within Texas, the most aggressive death penalty prosecutions are in the Harris County area, just outside of Houston. Since the resumption of the executions in 1976, the annual number of Harris County murders has plummeted from 701 to 241. That's a 72% decrease. Speeding up executions would strengthen that deterrent effect. For every 2.75 years cut from time spent on death row, which is a minimum of 6 years, one murder would be prevented, according to a 2004 study by FBI.
Josh, we're about out of time.
Sure.
We are out of time, so
Okay.
if you can finish up with a couple lines, sorry.
It can therefore be seen that fear of death does in fact deter people from committing murder. Not all murder, but a large enough percentage to prove that the death penalty does prevent violent crime.
All right. Thanks, guys.